The search is on for the Soldier of the Month amongst the medics of MASH on BBC Two in a couple of minutes, after which at 9:25 there's the penultimate episode tracing John le Carré's development of A Perfect Spy. While in half an hour we meet Tasmanian Ken Murray, who inherited the title Earl of Dunmore, and who at 73 discovers what it's like to be living like a lord when the visit takes him to the upper house. And then at 10:20 we've Sports Night with coverage of six-a-side football and bowls from Bournemouth. That's here on BBC One.
The 9 o'clock news from the BBC with Martin Lewis and Debbie Thrower.
Optimistic noises from the superpowers. Could the summit talks be going even further?
Cricket's crisis. The row with the umpire stops play. Now Gatting and England may come home early.
The Opran sufferers say the deal is not enough.
Geldof's warning. Ethiopia is a fortnight away from famine.
And the Royal Goblins gesture to the press corps. Good evening. There are indications tonight that the superpower summit talks in Washington may be moving further and more quickly than expected. An unprecedented meeting has just started at the Pentagon, headquarters of the American Armed Forces, between the Soviet Chief of Staff, Marshal Sergei Akrameyev, and the U.S. Defense Secretary, Frank Carlucci, one of many meetings tonight involving every single group of negotiators. It all follows what was described as a 2-hour roll-up-your-sleeves session between President Reagan and Mr. Gorbachev, including 20 minutes when the two leaders were alone together with just their interpreters. The only limited detail came from a Soviet spokesman, who confirmed that they had talked about a timetable for a Russian withdrawal from Afghanistan. The President's spokesman said, "It's in the middle chapters of the summit that the plot is revealed. Tomorrow we reach for the conclusions." Both sides agree that solid progress has been made. Both remain optimistic.
The General Secretary moved about town persuading and negotiating. His central meeting again was at the White House, 25 minutes alone with Mr. Reagan, then an hour and a half with their advisors. High on the agenda, Afghanistan, not whether but when the Soviet Union would withdraw.
The fact that we are ready to withdraw from Afghanistan is something that I have said some time ago. So what we are going to discuss will be more specific.
But the euphoria of the treaty signing was behind them. The harder issues were now being dealt with, either by working parties or by the two principals directly. And Mr. Reagan's spokesman had a word for it.
This was a day of heavy lifting.
As for the tone, the Soviet spokesman had something to say about that.
When the President and the General Secretary left the Oval Room, I was in the way, and General Secretary smiled at me and the President winked at me.
That was me.
Oh, sorry, I thought it was me.
There was substance, too, on the imbalance between Soviet and NATO conventional forces. Mr. Gerasimov acknowledged it.
And if one side has more of this particular system of weapons and the other side has more of that particular system of weapons, our idea and suggestion is to bring the level down to the minimum.
The White House negotiations are in mid-course. A lot of differences still, but a package of declarations may be ready tomorrow. Mr. Gorbachev's presence and personality are having such an impact here. They're drawing a positive response from public and politicians alike. A group of congressional leaders came to call. It wasn't the joint session of Congress that he'd have liked, but still he got their attention when he suggested that he might have problems at home with the ratification of the treaty. The cameras were off, but the microphones picked that up.
Perhaps for the first time in history, the process of ratification in our own country will not go through as easily as it has in the past.
Afterwards, he got favorable notices, even from conservative Republicans.
And he used phrases known to us Westerners as taking the bull by the horns, and so it was a very good, everything was thrown right out on the table. It was just superb.
Mr. Gorbachev attended a reception at the State Department, and there were lesser agreements on aviation, oceanography, and procedures for verifying nuclear tests. All this and autographs for the asking. The General Secretary has had the effect here of a diplomatic meteor, and Americans and Russians are remembering when they were allies.
Senior American and Soviet officials I've talked to here today believe the possibility exists of an extraordinarily wide-ranging agreement, which might, to borrow a phrase from British politics, break the mould of East-West relations. Whether such an agreement can actually be reached here depends on whether the two leaders are prepared to make difficult concessions to each other. At the moment, no one outside the small group of politicians and officials who've been directly involved in today's talks knows if it's starting to happen. But both sides can sketch out the form it might take. A 50% reduction in strategic weapons would be part of it, but both sides want that anyway. The other elements are interlocking. The Americans feel that while the Russians have a big numerical superiority in men and tanks in Europe, they have to rely on nuclear weapons. The Russians themselves now seem to accept that they do have more men and tanks in Europe. And according to one senior Soviet official I spoke to today, they've come here prepared to be forthcoming about that. Similarly, there'll always be opposition here to doing deals with Moscow while human rights violations continue to take place in the Soviet Union and while Soviet troops remain in Afghanistan. Mr. Gorbachev will only be able to get his troops out of Afghanistan if Mr. Reagan decides to help him diplomatically. And he'll only take action once and for all on human rights in the Soviet Union if there's a markedly better relationship with Washington, in which both sides basically support each other. To reach an agreement which would cover all these areas will demand a great deal of both men. We'll know tomorrow whether they can do it. Now back to the studio in London.
The detailed discussions about how to make cuts in long-range missiles are in the hands of advisers from both sides. There's already agreement in principle to halve the numbers of these strategic weapons, but there's no agreement about how it should be done. And it's not clear to what extent the Soviet side still sees America's SDI or Star Wars program as a sticking point.
America and the Soviet Union have the power to destroy each other many times over. 13,000 strategic warheads on the American side, over 10,000 on the Soviet, most targeted on cities and military bases. Both sides can deliver their warheads in three ways. They have long-range aircraft which either drop bombs or fire off missiles. There are also missiles deployed on submarines, twice as many with the Americans as the Russians. And there are missiles in silos. Of these, the Russians have 3 times as many as the Americans. Both sides agree they should cut their warhead totals to 6,000 each, but they disagree over exactly how many to allow on each of the 3 systems. Another dispute is over defences against these weapons. It's Russia's large force of land-based missiles that's led America to start researching a defence system in space, a controversial project to which President Reagan is personally committed. And it's been pushed hard.
We can't protect ourselves from nuclear weapons. And that's why the president wants to build the Peace Shield. It would stop missiles in outer space so they couldn't hit our house.
But the Russians have long had objections, which derailed the last summit at Reykjavik and threatened to delay this one. At home, the project's been criticized for its cost and sheer difficulty. The Russians have since admitted to doing their own space defense research. But more details are known about America's plan. The aim is to destroy incoming Soviet missiles during their 30-minute flights, ideally early on, when the rocket plume is bright. In this brief stage, the hope is an attack by laser, the beam fired by satellite. Another incentive to attack early is to destroy the missile's multiple warheads before they separate, because in the next stage, the warheads would be released from the missiles. Up to 10 from each, plus decoys, a total of up to 100,000 in a full Soviet attack. The hope lies with a particle beam to tell the real from the fake and destroy them. But this won't be ready for years. As any remaining warheads fall towards Earth, the plan is to hit them with lasers and missiles from the ground. Some parts of the project have already proved successful. In this test, a laser beam destroys part of a rocket, albeit stationary. But even some of the scientists involved admit the project is so complicated that to build a working system in space will take 1 or more likely 2 decades.
The England cricket tour of Pakistan looks like being called off after yesterday's extraordinary argument between Mike Gatting and the umpire Shakur Rana. There was no play in the second test today. Rana refuses to take the field until he receives a written apology from the England captain. Gatting wants an apology from Rana. Gatting twice clashed with the umpire yesterday. First, after an appeal for a catch was turned down.
Oh no, it's all right, off you go. One rule for one for another.
Then, in the last over of the day, Gatting and Rana had a furious row. Gatting claims he was accused of cheating. Rana says Gatting swore at him.
The series is a shambles. England made a point of being out in the middle on time, while the umpires and the Pakistani batsmen stayed firmly in the pavilion. The players are giving Mike Gatting their full support, but his captaincy must now be in jeopardy. He has offered to apologise for his behaviour of yesterday, but now wants an apology in return from umpire Rana, who he says called him a cheat. Negotiations between the two sides have been going on all day, looking in vain for a form of words that would satisfy everyone's honour. But neither side wants to be seen to be the first to call this tour off. It was revealed that Mike Gatting did have a meeting with the umpire to try to reach a compromise.
Well, they've both been in the room together this morning, and that was the sole purpose of getting an agreement. You think that would be possible, but Shaka Rahman wouldn't accept it.
What was the atmosphere like?
Well, a little bit tense, really, in the situation. The umpire is very sensitive.
He just abused me, you see. I can't tell you what did he say, the words, I mean, but he used the filthy language, bad language, abusing me like anything.
The players simply waited it out, clearly fed up. They haven't enjoyed this tour, and some wouldn't be sorry to see it over early. And it's hard to see how this match could now be played out in anything like a normal atmosphere.
Even the series may be called off because there's no point in playing the game of cricket if this is the sort of feeling are to prevail between the umpires and one of the sides.
The latest flare-up has highlighted the ill feeling that's grown between England and Pakistan. The England players felt that controversial umpiring decisions had helped Pakistan win the first test. And tonight, the former England captain Ian Botham sympathised with his old teammates. He said they had to accept decisions from ice cream salesmen with white coats on.
The bad feeling started when Pakistan toured England in the summer. First, as their wicket-keeper falsely claimed a catch off Botham. Cheating, said the Pakistan manager, was part and parcel of the international game. David Constant, the English umpire, was at the centre of the next row before the fifth test. Pakistan didn't want him. They said he was a rude man, but the TCCB insisted he took part. Then, in the World Cup, Javed Miandad clashed with Gatting. He said the England captain had sworn at him. And then in the first test, just 2 weeks ago, a further deterioration as Broad refused to leave the field when given out. He was merely reprimanded. Gatting's stand-up row with Shaka Rana has finally brought matters to a head. Both have been criticised, though the umpire is seen more as a victim of his own inexperience.
They're at a disadvantage because they only umpire at weekends, you see, and then they may go weeks without a match, and then they're thrown into the test match arena. And they say to me that that puts a tremendous amount of pressure on them.
The England captain shouldn't really do what he did. I don't think he should have got involved in a slanging match with the umpire on the field at this stage, or indeed at any other stage.
The TCCB stood back from the controversy today as officials kept in touch with events in Pakistan. The instructions to withdraw the team would come from here, but for the moment, there's the growing view that the congested fixture list is partly to blame.
We've played Pakistan far too many times. They've played us far too many times in the course of the last 12 months, and these things have gradually built up to stupid proportions.
England have pulled out of Pakistan before, in 1969, when political riots over the formation of Bangladesh made the safety of the players impossible to ensure. But if this tour is abandoned, it'll be the first time in the 111-year history of Test cricket that the players have been brought home because of events on the field.